Hans Eysenck was born on March 4, 1916 in Berlin, Germany. His mother, Ruth Eysenck, was an actress and his father, Edward Anton Eysenck, was a nightclub entertainer and he was an only child. Eysenck came from a Jewish family, and his dislike for Hitler led him to move to England in 1934, where he attended the University College London. Eysenck had a difficult time obtaining a job at first because he was a German citizen, but was later able to receive his PhD under the supervision of Cyril Bird, while working at the college in the psychology department. From 1915 until 1983, he worked as a professor at the Institute of Psychiatry at King's College. He published most of his work during this time, with over 80 books and 1,600 articles. He was the most cited British psychologist in social science journals. In 1990, Hans won the William James Fellow Award by the Association for Psychology Science in recognition of a lifetime of distinguished contribution to psychological science. On September 4, 1997, he passed away due to a brain tumor, leaving behind 4 sons and 1 daughter. Eysenck's personality theory. So, what is it? Hans Eysenck developed an approach to personality that was based around the idea of biological factors that are inherited in the form of a nervous system that affect our abilities to learn and adapt to our environment. His goal was to include behavior genetics, psychophysiology, cognitive psychology, aesthetics, and psychometrics into a unified theory of personality and individual differences. Key features of the Eysenck personality theory. A key assumption is that theory can work with simplified brain functioning that defines major systems, without specifying neural structures and processes in fine detail. In Eysenck's account, the main systems are a cortico-reticular circuit, linked to alertness and to extroversion, and a cortical limbic circuit, linked to emotion and neuroticism. The third factor of psychotism has been linked both to circuits for fight or flight state behavior and to excessive production of dopamine. The elements directly control individual differences in performance. In this theory, people with high extroversion would have a lower cortical arousal level than people with low extroversion, so they would be slower to form automatic associations. Eysenck referred to this as the traditional arousal theory. He would most likely have welcomed more research approaches that attempt to differentiate different roles for the different neurotransmitters that may modulate attention. Individual differences in performance and learning are necessary to be able to adapt to the real world. Eysenck's arousal theory explains the influence of many things, such as physical health, mental health, social functioning, criminal behavior, work preferences, and performances. Eysenck's account of personality emphasized interaction of traits with situational conditioners. An example of this includes an introverted individual who would be overly aroused by general levels of stimulation. A neurotic individual would be overstimulated by emotion-driven stimuli. According to this theory, introverted people would perform with poorer outcomes in stimulating environments, such as social encounters and demanding work environments. Meanwhile, neurotics, we would see them being more prone to emotional disorders when exposed to stressors. Key challenges of the Eysenck personality theory. One of the key challenges to this theory is the oversimplification of brain systems involved. For example, in Eysenck's theory, cortical arousal plays a central role, but it may not serve as an accurate measure of functional brain processes. Also, the theory states that the cortico-reticular loop supports alertness. In research done with brain imaging data, it's been suggested that this could be controlled by multiple predominantly right brain structures. These are just 2 examples of the oversimplification that have been challenged in this theory. Another challenge would be the complexity of the arousal response, which relates to traditional arousal theory. Since this theory came out, there have been multiple studies done that suggest autonomic and central nervous systems arousal doesn't necessarily suggest any general factor corresponding to arousal or mental effort. It's been suggested that psychophysiological responses may be more useful when more narrowly interpreted in relation to specific brain processes. There were also inconsistencies brought between brain processes and self-reports to assess personality traits. It's been argued that self-reports are not well suited for measuring brain systems because of introspection and conscious awareness. Furthermore, Eysenck's theory overlooked the difference between implicit and explicit traits. Lastly, other key challenges we have seen that counter this theory come from the social cognitive and cognitive perspectives. Eysenck's theory fails to look at cultural and social factors that could accompany the underlying biological factors to form personality. Following intelligence research, social policy aimed to equalize education by making it compensatory and possible for lower income families. However, as time went on, they noticed that the test scores were not equaling out to the extent they expected, despite providing equal opportunities. There still remained a 12-point IQ difference between the white students and the black students. This led researchers to believe that IQ scores had less to do with the school environment and more to do with familial factors. Specifically, a researcher named Jensen argued that the remaining difference in IQ scores suggested that IQ was highly genetic. Eysenck took this idea more boldly and began to argue that intelligence was mainly genetic. Publishing his book, The IQ Argument: Race, Intelligence, and Education, Eysenck's main point was that IQ differences between white and black Americans was due to genetic factors. He even went as far to say the whole course of development of a child's intellectual capabilities is largely laid down genetically, and even extreme environmental changes have little power to alter this development. In Eysenck's book, he argued that 80% of IQ is inherited, stating, "All the evidence to date suggests the overwhelming importance of genetic factors in producing the great variety of intellectual differences which we observe in all culture, and much of the difference observed between certain racial groups." As you can imagine, such statements caused an uproar. Not only did Eysenck make claims about the intelligence of Black Americans, but also Italians, Spanish, Africans, Asians, and many others. At the time, Eysenck received many threats and was even assaulted by a female writer, but he held onto his biological basis for intelligence for many years, suggested that it was not racism, but empirical biology. Interesting, Eysenck grew up in Nazi Germany and argued that he wasn't talking about racial superiority. Rather, he stated that individuals that refused to acknowledge empirical science were being harmful to society. Towards the end of his life, he began to concede that heritability impacted IQ less than he had believed, and that environment does also play an important role in IQ scores and life success. Fellow researchers were concerned when Eysenck claimed that some types of personality were more prone to disease than others. The cancer-prone personalities were more likely to die from cancer than their healthy personality counterparts. Eysenck also claimed his method of psychological therapy reduced the mortality rate. In 1991, the methodology of one of his studies was investigated. Researchers found that a subgroup of 41 people who had malignant hypertension were included in the randomized trial for the psychological therapy. In Eysenck's study, they were described as stressed but healthy. However, this particular group had a high mortality on follow-up. In the following years, this manipulation of research sample brought further complaints, as well as other claims of professional misconduct. Nowadays, over 60 of his publications are deemed unsafe, and journals have considered removing his work from their platforms. Without question, Hans Eysenck made invaluable contributions to the field of psychology. His works may have inspired younger generations of scientists and their work as well. However, his controversial case only highlights the importance of the scrutiny of academic works. It is important to question authors and carry investigations on their methodologies to avoid academic fraud and false information that could result problematic to the general public. Thank you.